Hello everybody, my name is Dratnos, and today we are going to talk about borrowed power. So borrowed power is something that you'll see on Twitter, thrown about in discussions, often complaints about World of Warcraft expansions. But oftentimes it's not particularly well defined, or I think that some of the implications around the discussion aren't fully explored in a lot of cases. So today I wanted to make this video to define the term, talk about the places in WoW's history that borrowed power has been used, give some examples of, I think, places where it's been used well, and talk about the source of the complaints that you're seeing surrounding borrowed power. So let's start off with defining the term. What is borrowed power? Borrowed power is any effects that your character gains that are not permanent, right? They're not part of your character at a core level. They're from some sort of temporary system. So an example of this would be Azerite essences, right? Azerite essences are things that make your character stronger. In fact, they're often the major one is a button you can put on your bar, and so it's an ability, but it goes away when Battle for Azeroth ends, right? Other examples of this are like Azerite armor as well. Similar sort of effect here where you're gaining some effect, you gain some trait, but unlike something that's on your talent tree or something that's in your spellbook as you level up, these effects go away at some point in the future, right? They have an expiration date on them. And at that point, your character reverts back to that baseline that is just your spellbook and your talents, and all the borrowed power eventually goes away. Now, borrowed power can be a big source of frustration because people feel like that baseline of what the class is too little, right? You get to this spot in 8.0 where you level your character up, you lose all of your Legion borrowed power, so you lose your legendaries, you lose your artifact weapon effects, and then you don't really gain much in 8.0, right? In 8.0, we got one ring Azerite armor, and that was it. There was no other huge wealth of, sources of power to come in to enhance our character, to make our character feel interesting and fun to play. And to some extent, even just all the secondary stats that you have at the end of an expansion are sort of borrowed power compared to the start of an expansion where your haste is like -2 and your attacks take 3 or 4 years to go from, the wind up to the damage instance at the end. So that's, I think, the main source of complaints that people have surrounding borrowed power, right? Let's bring out an old friend here, Microsoft Paint. So with Microsoft Paint here, let's just illustrate this effect with a handy Microsoft Paint graph. You guys thought you were getting away without Microsoft Paint in this one. You thought it was going to be a Wowhead article only video, but no, it's always a Microsoft Paint video. That's the secret. We've evolved from the tier list videos to just Microsoft Paint, all videos, 100% of the time. So x-axis. X-axis is going to be like, I should have thought this through. I should have thought this through more. We'll figure out the name later. I'm not even sure there really is an x-axis for this one. But let's do, so we're going to describe here what percentage of your character and the fun to play of it comes from different sources, right? So there's some amount of your character's design that's just kind of a baseline, right? This is like your talents, your spellbook. This is evergreen. It does get changed. This does get changed between expansions, but we don't really count this as borrowed power, right? Even though Affliction Warlock gains Malefic Rapture in Shadowlands, and the spec has changed abilities between BFA and Shadowlands, we don't really consider that to be borrowed power. We consider that more just like the unborrowed, the permanent power changing slightly. Although you could make an argument that even that kind of stuff might fall into this discussion as well. But so this is just permanent parts of your character. Permanent. Oh, there are going to be a lot of people complaining about this being hard to read again, huh? Well, it's just gonna be that way. All right, so these are the permanent parts of your character power level, right? And then we get these other additions that get layered on top, right? So we'll do a BFA example, right? So then we have our Azerite armor coming in here in this beautiful Microsoft Paint red default. Azerite. Then we have our essences coming in, and essences do quite a bit for our guys, so make that a nice little box here. Essences, and this isn't directly proportional to how much DPS they represent, but it's a combination of how much of your damage or throughput they represent and how much of the play style adjustments to your character they make. For essences, it's a little bit weird because some specs don't really feel their essences much at all. And some specs have passive essences that don't really matter that much. Other specs have stuff like, well, actually, one passive essence that does change how things play a lot is like Vision of Perfection, or stuff like Lucid Dreams Major, which dramatically change how your spec feels when you press those buttons, right? Compared to something like Crucible Flame that's like, okay, it's, I press this once every 30 seconds and it does some damage, or Focusing Iris, I press this once every 90 seconds and it does some damage. Those ones are a little bit less, class play style changing, so I'm averaging that out though. And then in 8.3, we got Corruption, which, depending on your spec, this added quite a lot, right? So you got to this point where Corruption represented our character's power, right? So, all right, I figured out what my axes are. So this is like a character, and this is like power. Close enough. So this is what BFA looked like, right? In BFA, some of our power is permanent class-based stuff. Class design even is what you could call this down here. Permanent, put in open parentheses, class design, close parentheses. That is what is going to happen here. This system was, the problems with this system is that we were left at about this much power for the first year of the expansion, right? Through Battle to Zaralor and Crucible. It wasn't really until we got to Ajar's Eternal Palace that we started getting, in Battle to Zaralor, we unlocked like the second ring of Azerite, and then in Eternal Palace, we started getting our essences, and then our characters started to feel somewhat like complete classes, and then Corruption came around and turbocharged characters into these ultra, endgame monsters that have 7,000% haste or whatever, so that, honestly, this may go up above the screen here in terms of this, but at the start of the expansion, it felt pretty bad, right? It felt pretty bad. And it creates this kind of anxiety going into a new expansion that I'm about to have more than half of my character's power and the interesting stuff chopped away again. Now, the good news is that in Shadowlands, it looks like we're going to hit the ground running with a little bit more stuff, right? It looks like we're going to hit the ground running with, in addition to the permanent class design, we're going to have legendary effects, pretty powerful. That might even be bigger than this. I might be supposed to be making this bigger. Legendaries. And we're also going to have our Covenant abilities, which you may not enjoy the choice nature of it, but they're certainly impactful. So Covenant abilities. And there's also other Covenant stuff that gets in here as well, Soulbinds and Conduits, which I'll just throw it in here, plus Soulbinds, plus Conduits. So we're likely to not replicate, in my opinion, the same thing that 8.0 had, where your spec felt incomplete for the first year of the expansion. I think that you're gonna these categories are gonna represent enough stuff that your spec is going to feel like a full spec already going into the new expansion. So I don't actually think that borrowed power is inherently a bad thing. I do think it's really important that they make sure to keep us above like this line here at the start of an expansion, right? If there's just not enough stuff going on at the start of an expansion, then our specs are going to feel really empty, and that can be bad. Now, you could also accomplish this, and one thing that a lot of people talk about wanting is just wanting the core specs to have almost all this stuff, right? My problem with that is that I actually think it's pretty great going from expansion to expansion, having your character behave differently, right? I think that playing the same stuff for 2 years, it's not even the same stuff, right? Because you get this stuff added onto it. But if you were to play that same baseline character over a really long period of time, I think it would start to get boring. So I think that it is good that we have borrowed power. I just think it's important that it's managed and you either make it so that the permanent class design in and of itself, or you make it so the permanent class design plus whatever you get on day one of the expansion is enough to make the class feel satisfying and feel fulfilled in and of itself. And that is something that I believe they failed with in BFA, but I don't think they failed with it in Legion, and I don't think they failed with it in previous expansions as well that did have borrowed power elements. Doesn't look to me like Shadowlands is going to fall into that problem either. So borrowed power in and of itself, not a bad thing. Now that's what we've been talking about so far has been expansion level borrowed power. One thing that even some of the people that I see on Twitter, I've seen Twitter timelines that have been pretty internally inconsistent, right? There are two different tweets that directly contradict each other, particularly around borrowed power. There's a very common theme with borrowed power that people don't like borrowed power as an idea, but they also like systems that are borrowed power. And the biggest example of this to me is tier sets. Tier sets are fundamentally borrowed power, right? This is, in fact, much more frequently lost and then reborrowed power than expansion level systems, right? Tier sets, you get 3 of these per expansion when we had them. And these were I would say, borrowed power taken, even kicked up a notch from these expansion level systems. And I thought tier sets were awesome. I think that they accomplished even more than the expansion level systems did in terms of making your spec feel different to play from, you go 6 months, you get into your new raid, and all of a sudden you'd get this thing where like, all right, now I'm casting Blade Storm on single target because it casts 2 free Mortal Strikes while it's out, and like, this is rotation changing, it's fun, my spec plays differently, I do cool amounts of damage in different parts of my rotation every time. This is also an easy tuning knob that they have with, in BFA, if a spec was overtuned, they kind of had to look at it and be like, all right, we gotta change something here. And there's this delicate balancing act that they're doing right at all times where a spec is, maybe it's okay in PvP and Mythic Plus, but it's overtuned in Raid. And so how do you fix that without making it bad in 2 of the 3 parts of the game? Oftentimes you can't, and you just have to nerf it across the board on the time scales they work at. Whereas when tier sets are around, you not only have all those benefits of the borrowed power creating a fun and different way to play your spec, which I think was really valuable, but you also have a tuning knob where if this spec is overpowered in AoE situations, but underpowered in single target situations, you can just give them a really strong single target tier set bonus that has no benefit in AoE at all, right? You can give some kind of like, Windwalker Monk Crackling Jade Lightning effect on a tier set bonus, and then bang, that helps up their single target. Doesn't do a single thing for them in AoE where they're already fine, right? That's a BFA example, of course. In Shadowlands, Windwalker's target capped, so definitely not fine at AoE. But that was a BFA example. It was a BFA example. So I think that tier sets are fantastic, and tier sets are absolutely borrowed power. So if you dislike borrowed power, if you're somebody who came into this video and you're thinking you dislike borrowed power, you have to also dislike tier sets if you dislike borrowed power, right? They're one and the same thing. Borrowed power. Tier sets are a subset of borrowed power. So that, I think, to me, tier sets are a great example of how borrowed power can be done well. But I actually think that most systems in the game's history have been good examples of borrowed power done well. I think that some of the weakest we've ever seen were Azurite Armor and Azurite Essences. I think that those were not particularly compelling because they didn't really change how your character played in a lot of cases, and they didn't really, like, a lot of damage came out of them, but it didn't really feel particularly satisfying, given that, particularly the Azurite Essence front, you were just clicking your 1 button every 3 minutes or 2 minutes or 1.5 minutes, and it was doing damage, and it was kind of a forgettable experience, right? And it didn't tie into your class-specific mechanics, whereas tier sets did the opposite of that. So those are my thoughts on borrowed power. I think that it is a great tool that should be used liberally. It is important to make sure that you keep classes at all times above some line below which they stop being engaging. You can't have these 8.0 patches where specs feel awful. And there are some specs in the game that probably in BFA looked much like this, right? They looked like this, but even shifted further down, right? There were specs in BFA that kind of looked like this, right? That were way below that line. The line came down this time, but imagine it's still up there because their classes, there were some class design elements where perhaps there were some specs that were left a little bit behind, and borrowed power can sometimes mask those effects on damage meters and in playstyle, and then it can be really apparent that it's gone when you get into the next expansion, when all the stuff that was propping you up goes away. But I don't think that those problems should be attributed to borrowed power. I think that the borrowed power systems are fine. It's just important that you have a good base upon which to build them. And in some cases, I think borrowed power takes the blame for when that base is bad. But really, this is what the issue is this part done well? And if it is, then the borrowed power, I think, is just pure upside on top of that. Anyways, that's been my take on borrowed power. Hope you enjoyed this video. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Come check out my Twitch stream, twitch.tv/Dratnos. I'll be streaming some more once Shadowlands comes out. Until then, maybe a little bit lighter on the streams. I don't know. Maybe I'll stream the new Path of Exile League or something. And remember to like the video and stuff. Thanks everybody for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Bye.